Hey everyone, it's Kay, and this is Dark Tales from the Road. Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining me today for episode 39. We are heading to Ohio. I am excited. This is definitely a spooky one. Anyways, let's go ahead and get started. We're heading to Ohio. We're going to be visiting the Ohio State Reformatory in Mansfield, Ohio. So pumped about this one, guys. It's very spooky. So, if you're new here, I like to start with we're going to do history of Ohio, a little history of Mansfield, which is the city it's located in, and then we jump right into the subject. So, a little bit about Ohio. It was colonized by fur traders. It was colonized by French fur traders and then became a part of the British colony at that time. And they came into possession because of the French and Indian War in 1754. And so then after the American Revolution was when Britain seceded the territory to the U.S. Ohio became a state March 1st of 1803. But what's crazy is there was no formal declaration that was made until 1953 when President Eisenhower officially assigned the documents making it a state, retroactive to its original date. That's crazy. Like, how does that happen? How does that fall through the cracks that Ohio was to be a state in 1803 and they didn't realize it until 1953? I don't know, guys. Ohio is sometimes called the mother of modern presidents. There have been 7 Ohioans that have been in the White House since 1869. It's known for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in Cleveland, the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center in Cincinnati, and the National Football League Hall of Fame in Canton. Ohio got its name from the Iroquois. The word Ohio, it's what it says, O-Y-O, meaning Great River. And the Iroquois Indians, they settled in that area around the Ohio River and the Great Lakes around 1650. And that's how it got its name, Ohio. The city of Cleveland was founded by a man named Moses Cleveland in 1796. He was a surveyor that was in the area. He worked for the Connecticut Land Company. And so he was a surveyor in that area and helps to found Cleveland, which was also named after him. March 4th, 1970, there was a 3-day protest at Kent State University. It was an anti-Vietnam War protest. 4 students were killed and 9 were wounded when the National Guard stepped in, and there were 29 of them that opened fire on the campus. Oh my gosh. And of the 4 students who were killed, only 2 of them had actually been involved with the protest. So just civilians, And it wasn't until 4 years later that 8 of the guardsmen faced trial, were acquitted. It's awful. It's such a sad story, and it's a good one to know. If you're into history, it's a good one to look up. So the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, actually filed a lawsuit against Ohio in 1997 because their motto at the time was, quote, "With God, all things are possible." And they said that it violated the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, which is the freedom of religion. And so Ohio was permitted to keep their motto because of the federal ruling that determined it did not endorse a specific God and there's no violation of the First Amendment. So something to think about. I have no opinion on that. Ohio's nickname is the Buckeye State, and that is actually a tree. I've always wondered what a buckeye is. I know there's a dessert called the Buckeye. And it's very delicious, but yeah, it was a ton of local Buckeye trees, and they actually bear fruit. And so the fruit resembles the eye of a male deer. That was, and that came from the early Native Americans. And so that's kind of cool that it kept that going so much, like so far, that it's still now to this day known as the Buckeye State. And then, like I talked about earlier, it is the mother of modern presidents. So there were 7 presidents that their birthplace was in Ohio: Ulysses S. Grant, Rutherford B. Hayes, James Garfield, Benjamin Harrison, William McKinley, William H. Taft, and Warren G. Harding. So now I'm going to jump into Mansfield, the city of Mansfield. So it was named after another surveyor. He did not found it. There were some other men that did found? Yes, Mansfield, but it was named after, he was a surveyor general of the U.S., I can't read, surveyor general of the U.S., and his name was Colonel Jared Mansfield. So Mansfield was settled on a ridge by a large spring, and it was actually their source of water. But this article actually mentioned it was a dependable source of water for a brewery. So that must have been a very early thing that Ohio had established. Sadly, around the 1800s, though, Indian attacks were common in the area, and several settlers had lost their lives. And it's just the same thing, different story. Every week I've been doing kind of the Midwest, and I bounce all over the U.S., but that's the big thing, and sent to Oklahoma and all that stuff. So I didn't touch too much on it, but the area still has a lot of Native Americans living there. They actually have a celebration, and it's held in July and September, so twice a year, and it is the Great Mohican Indian Powwow. So they, even though, every state, man, they were pushed out, but Ohio really retained a lot of their Native American history and the Native American people, so that's pretty sweet. So after the Civil War, Mansfield was becoming very industrial. They actually built and supplied buggies, steel, steam tractors, stoves, pumps, and major appliances. And so it's in Richland County, which it was named after the rich lands that were around them. And there's a really famous guy that came out of Richland County, and his name was the Apple Man. He's better known as Johnny Appleseed. His name was John Chapman. He actually lived and traveled in the area for many, many years, planting apple trees to help the new settlers, which we have all heard Johnny Appleseed, but I've never heard that story before, so I think that was pretty cool. And there's also a famous mountain man, part of Richland County. His name was Jedediah Smith. He helped to pioneer the Santa Fe Trail. So again, I'm keeping the histories a little shorter. I'm trying not to get the episodes to be well over an hour. I would like them a little shorter lately. So it is already time to jump into Ohio State Reformatory. It's very easy to get this mixed up with the Ohio State Penitentiary, because I already did that. I was going through my notes, and I was just like, what? That happened too? Well, that happened too. I was so confused, and I had gotten them mixed up. The Reformatory is in Mansfield. The penitentiary is in Columbus. So they're a good distance away from each other. So again, Ohio State Reformatory. Zachy Baby has been there. I have notes on the episode at the very end, but it's a good episode. It's pretty creepy. It's one of his older ones. It's from season 3. I really liked it though. So it was initially known as the Mansfield Reformatory, and it opened in 1886. So it was home to very, very violent people. It wasn't at first, but it definitely ended its life like that. And these people were so horrible and violent that now they have violent ghosts and spirits running around. So they can feel spirits of inmates who are rioting. that fought with each other. And there was so much overcrowding at the very end of its life in the isolation cells. And so former prisoners are just like stuck in the cells, stuck walking the halls. Very, very creepy. And like if you watch Ghost Adventures, you can really see the inside of it, and it's just massive creepy vibes. So it wasn't built to actually function as a prison. We'll get to it, but it is built definitely for not as much violence and more for rehabilitation. And so with this change that it made into this violence, it created this extremely dark history. So it cost at the time $1.3 million to build this. And so in 2023 money, it's $36 million. So a huge chunk of change there. And it took 10 years to build, which at that time makes sense, but that is also a very long time to build something. And so, like I said, it definitely transitioned into a high security prison, bringing in more violent prisoners. When visitors are there, they can feel the frustration and the rage and the despair among the former prisoners, like all around them. And you'll see that in Ghost Adventures, where it's like they feel things in the room with them. Something's not right. Someone's in here with us, and they like the ghosts are feeding off of them and creating these emotions. One of the most famous parts of the prison is the quote, the hole, and it is a very, very small cell. And to be punished in the hole, you were held there for 3 days. And it had been reported that there were sometimes held 2 inmates at the time. And a lot of the times you put 1 or more into solitary confinement. One usually did not make it out alive. A lot of death. It eventually closed in 1990, and there were actually 4 movies that were made that were filmed at the Reformatory, and the most famous one is The Shawshank Redemption in 1993. So now I'm like, well, I've seen the movie a million times, but now I'm like, oh, I want to go back and kind of look around, and now I'm super curious about it. Like, they have pictures online of the warden's office and stuff, and it's identical. It's really cool. So I found an article, and I'd like to read it word for word. Just, I feel so bad like taking things from like news articles and stuff, and not any article. Sorry, not just news. But this one, I really liked how they told the story, explained everything. So I like to kind of keep it all whole for them, if that makes sense. So the title of the article is called Ghostly History of OSR, which is Ohio State Reformatory. This was Channel News 4 in Columbus, Ohio in 1997. So it says, quote, "Stone walls and iron bars, they're still here, but what of the humanity, if you can call it that, of the Ohio State Reformatory at Mansfield? What of the 154,000 inmates who passed through its gates in its 94 years as a working prison? Not to mention their keepers like the wardens and the guards, the gravediggers, and the rest. What of them remains? As it turns out, more than you think. No matter what their crime, some sent to Mansfield have never left. They rest unclaimed in a cheerless graveyard just outside the fence. 215 numbered markers lay out row to row. Most of the victims of disease, influenza, tuberculosis, and some died of less natural causes, from violence that is all too common inside any prison, was far from unknown in this one. And the worst of it occurred well away from the main cell block, with their rows of cages stacked on tier tier, and inmates 1 or 2 to a cell. There were too many eyes, too many witnesses here. The worst of it was reserved for a far lonelier place deep beneath the prison ground. A place called local control, or solitary by some, known by everyone else as the hole. Near total isolation can crack all but the toughest of cons, but none was so alone that there wasn't room for death. At least one inmate managed to hang himself, another set himself on fire. Once two men left too long in a single tomb-like cell, only one walked out, leaving his cellmate's body behind, stuffed beneath a bunk. Could there be another similar surprises? Or words left over from the days before the prison closed? Even when they're empty, some swear something walks these halls. It isn't enough for contemporary visitors not to wander off alone while sightseeing. What's become of one of Mansfield's most popular tourist attractions. But the bloodiest single incident in the old prison's history occurred outside its walls. In July 1948, when the Reformatory's farm boss, his wife and daughter were kidnapped and shot dead by two parolees bent on revenge. A 6-state manhunt for the so-called Mad Dog Killers ended in a shootout that left Robert Daniels of Columbus in custody and his partner, James West, dead. Quote, "I'll get the chair," Daniels told police as he signed the confession, and on January 3rd, 1949, he did. A year later, in 1950, disaster struck again, this time in the living quarters of the warden himself. The warden's wife, removing the jewelry box from a closet shelf, dislodged a pistol from its hiding place. When it hit the floor, the gun went off, inflicting a fatal wound, and within the decade, even more bad luck. The warden, hard at work in his office, suffered a heart attack and died. All of this was nearly 40 years ago and more. How then to explain the voices shaken tour guides swear they hear today? Men and women talking, too faint to understand, too persistent to ignore, and chilling to listeners who think they're alone, only to find themselves apparently eavesdropping on the warden and his wife, locked forever in their endless conversation from beyond the grave. I really liked that article. I think they wrote it beautifully. But yeah, so much tragedy, dark history, so much violence. So I'm going to kind of backtrack a little bit into some of the history of it. So it was designed by a Cleveland architect. His name was Levi Schofield, and it is built out of limestone. He did it to make it feel more inspiring and uplifting, but also stay a very intimidating structure. So it was originally called the, quote, Intermediate Penitentiary, and then like the Mansfield Penitentiary, and then the Mansfield Reformatory, and then Ohio State Reformatory. But it would, in its early days, it would accept inmates that were too old to do like the juvenile correction system, but they were too old, but they committed offenses that were pretty major. And then a lot of the juveniles, or the worst of the worst, they got sent to Ohio State Penitentiary in Columbus. And so 1896 is when it opened and brought its first inmates in. So, like I said, at the beginning, it was not a violent place. The goal of it was to reform and rehabilitate the inmates. And so while they were there, they really focused on religion, education, and trade. They would come there for 18 months, and if they showed progress with all of that, they could be released after that time. But if not, they would serve another 18 months, and it was actually extremely successful. They had a very high success rate and a low violence rate at the same time. You know, they're keeping them busy and really working hard to rehabilitate. But in the 1960s, the state pulled its financial support. they didn't like the reform model anymore, and so they changed OSR to a maximum security facility, was never intended to be. Never. By the 1980s, the conditions of the place had massively deteriorated. The inmates actually sued the state of Ohio, and it was successful. So they started construction on a new facility nearby, and the reformatory ended up closing in 1990. Then sat empty for several years until different activists purchased the building from the state for $1, and they committed to repairing and restoring it as a historic structure. So here's another article that I would love to read word for word, because Stephanie Crumley, who wrote it September 23rd, 2019, did an amazing job, and I love what she said. So it's called "A Look in the Dark. Ohio State Reformatory is Haunted as Fuck." I love you, Stephanie. So here's what she said. Quote, "When I first moved to Ohio, one of the places I was most excited about seeing was the Ohio State Reformatory, aka Mansfield Reformatory. Photos show a beautiful medley of Victorian Gothic meets Romanesque revival, its interiors frozen in the mid-20th century, never aging or changing thanks to state funding. That's the surface. Then you start learning more about the history and all of the creatures that continue to live out time within these walls. The building has borne witness to some atrocities toward humanity, abuse, human rights infringements, murder, and suicide that have caused many to stay after their bodies have gone. Before we get into some of the more famous and horrifying ghosts of the place, my own personal experience, let's do a quick life history lesson. Ohio State Reformatory, originally named the Intermediary Penitentiary, began construction in 1886. The hope was this reformatory would be a place for non-violent first-time offenders as a sort of halfway point between the Boys Reformatory in Lancaster and Columbus State Penitentiary. While the prison received its first 150 prisoners in 1896, construction wasn't completed until about 1910. It didn't take very long for the prison to stray from its original intention. As the criminal population of Columbus rose, prisoners with violent offenses and serial crimes were placed at OSR. The prison became overpopulated. Rooms intended for a single occupant now held 3 residents at a time. Approximately 200 people perished during the time of incarceration from disease, murder, or suicide. The increased population and the understaffing brought a series of torturous punishments. Misbehaving residents could be susceptible to the popular hole, the sweat box, which I could only imagine was like a sauna but not in a good way, water tubes, and finally the butterfly, an electrical shocking device. That's only the beginning, but it's no wonder that the prison was shut down in 1990 due to inhumane and overpopulated conditions. The vestiges of misery acquired over a near century of operation continue to haunt the hallways unapologetically in the forms of tens upon tens of very active ghosts scattered about the large prison. There are lots of ghosts here. The statement is not unfounded. There's a ton of documented evidence from professional paranormal teams to weekly ghost overnights that OSR hosts during the fall season. You too can check out the haunted history as an overnight experience. That's something I have not yet done. All of my experiences with the OSR have been exclusively during the daytime, but even so, it's been chilling to say the least. The basement is home to 2 specific entities, one tragic and one nefarious. According to lore, a 14-year-old boy was beaten to death in the basement. His shadow is seen flickering across walls or out of the corner of your eye if he's escaping. Despite the lack of description, you'll be able to decipher his presence from the other ghostly resident of the basement. While the energy of the boy is light, you can feel something unnerving and unsettling approach when the guard is in your presence. He has been described as a sinister experience and potentially believed to be the murderer of the young boy. As you would expect, the whole of the prison is another real hotspot for paranormal experiences. For those of you unfamiliar, the whole is an accumulation of small cells intended for the isolation of particularly naughty prisoners. Prisoners were not allowed to leave their cell in their time within the hole, and the rooms within the hole had no exposure to natural light. It was a pretty miserable place to be, and such a punitive technique that been known to drive people to and over the brink of insanity. One of the most unsettling stories about the hole has to do with a guard set two prisoners within the same cell and one emerged. All in all, it was said that 100 prisoners were sent to the hole in the space that was intended for only 20. Living people who entered the hole experienced nausea, cold spots, breathing, and generally a lot of get me out of here discomfort. Alright, the chapel sanctuary was one of the first places I really got creeped out. Despite the fact that it was daytime and the whole place is absolutely beautiful, I kept feeling as if something lingering in the shadows, looking at me, wishing me harm. I felt as if it was time to move on and definitely didn't want to spend too much time assessing the room. Again, I'm a huge fan of religious spaces from an artistic and anthropological perspective, and this unnerving desire to get the fuck out is rare for me. But there I was, desiring to get the hell out as soon as humanly possible. Ironically, this space was once used for executions, despite slapping some religious iconography and calling it a sanctuary. So this place is considered to be the most haunted location within the building. The chair room is probably one of the strangest and most unassuming sights of the OSR. You're walking down a hallway and you look to your right. Here is this windowless room with a chair placed in the middle, facing outward towards you, like someone is watching you. Legend has it that a very dark entity lives in this room and prefers for the chair to be in the middle of the room. If you move the chair, expect for it to move back soon after. During my research, I found one account where a person sat in the chair, provoking the spirit. By provoking, I mean yelling at it, inciting it to take action. The person left with scratch marks all down their back. This is one of the only physical manifestations from the hauntings that I could find. Personally, I did not feel comfortable, not even a little bit, entering the room. I felt as if someone was staring at me intimidatingly and binding me to move along my route. Clearly, when you're in prison, you're going to spend a lot of time in the cell blocks. And the cell blocks is where I had my most uncomfortable and terrifying experience of the whole prison. These, after all, were where most of the prisoners spent the duration of their stays. These small cells were overcrowded, spilling over maximum occupancy early in the history of the prison. It's really safe to say this was a miserable place where people lived miserable existences. Suicides and tragedies were not uncommon. In 1930, a large fire broke out, killing 330 people and severely injuring 200 others. Those who survived were confined to a hot, crowded attic space covered in painful burns that, based on conditions, probably were prone to infection. While there were a lot of suicides in the building, 2 of them were infamous throughout the East Cell Block, one of which is James Lockhart. It's believed that Lockhart, who had less violent offenses than his cellmate and neighbors, was experiencing bullying and threats. To escape his fate at their hands, he stole a can of turpentine and set himself on fire. The fire was so significant that all that anyone could do was watch him slowly melt, screaming and writhing in pain as he died. That's some next level shit. Larry Hamer, a prisoner who was a week due from transferring, made a noose out of his bed sheets and tossed himself over the railing, hanging himself. Everyone assumes that there's a fate worse than death waiting for him at that other prison. So a lot to work for haunting material, right? Well, I painted a more elaborate context because 1, I literally saw a goddamn ghost, and 2, I got so nauseous and dizzy walking around these cell blocks that I had to stop multiple times. Someone, a shadow, was watching me walking through the cell blocks, which is pretty fucking creepy. Before it appeared, the experience of nausea came on, which is a common occurrence when the air pressure is changing and the energy levels are wacky from another presence. So whether you believe me or not, that's on you. If you don't believe in these sorts of things, that's cool too. I do, obviously, and I can pretty much assure you that if you go over to the Ohio State Reformatory, you are going to experience something there. Their tour season is coming to a close on September 30th. Hurry on over there. And then they do also haunted attractions. So, yeah, that Stephanie killed it. I had to include her stuff because I really like how she wrote out this article. So, we're going to move on. For the last thing here, Ghost Adventures went there. It's season 3, episode 20. That's what online told me, but it didn't actually be that. Where's my grammar? I don't know. On Discovery Plus, it was something different, but it was shown on 11/20 of 2009. That's what always helps me find them. So Zach and Aaron and Nick go there so this was during the interviews. Inmates there, when they first came in, had no name anymore. They just told them their inmate numbers, and that was also true when they were buried in the cemetery. If no one claimed them, there was a cross with just their inmate number. Like, they totally lost their identity. So the cell blocks are 5 stories high. They talk about the small railing and people being pushed over, fell over, or had hung themselves. Then the story was told about the guy who set himself on fire. They said he covered himself in paint thinner, set himself on fire, and the guy that was taking them around was a former inmate. And so he said he had the cell next to his, and he can feel him in there, and he's very, very mad at him for committing suicide. A manager heard a bang and saw a white figure peek out and then backed up, like, oh my gosh, I'm caught. Another tour guide saw a black mass run to a cell and then growled fucker at him. Zach saw a figure while they were touring. They say that the entities there are very aggressive to female staff, that they've been hit and their hair pulled a lot. They have a room, it's called the toilet room, which it has like 1 million toilets in it. They're not functioning, they're just like stacked in there. So yeah, but they said that's the area that is not safe for women. They see shadows down there. They don't feel good. They start feeling horrible, and I guess one gal was coming down the stairs and was pushed and ended up hitting her head, I think on like the railing or something. During the interview, Zach gets hit with a cold spot. They go looking around the hole, and they said it was like constantly 98 degrees in there, and they were only given a Bible. There were multiple guards that were murdered there. One of the same guys said he felt something very violent, like, come up at him. Like, he does it to Zach, but it's like something coming up right into your face, like getting in your face. And so he, felt it, and he was so scared. And so he said to the entity, "I'm not afraid of you." And so then he got a response on an EVP that said, "Outstanding." Ugh. That just kind of, oof, I don't like that. And then they had an old man who was touring or something like that. He was dying of cancer. And so, yeah. And they're just walking around, and they get an EVP that says, "I'll kill this freak." What? Come on. And so they were on death row at this point. And so they say this is the dark side of death row because there's no light coming in from any of it. So they're over there, and they have EVPs of screams. And so they're all standing there talking, and all of a sudden, all the batteries die. All of their audio. But the audio for the camera is still going. So you can hear them. It is a little more faint, but you can still hear what Zach and them are saying. And so then Zach and the tour guide, he's a male. He's very big and buff. And so similar to Zach, they start yelling at them. Not too threatening, but you know how Zach yells. And They all of a sudden start feeling like they're getting touched. They start yelling again. Then all of a sudden the camera has a very high frequency volt, and like you can hear it. It's just this like really high pitched all of a sudden, and it just completely kills all audio. So they're walking around like yelling into the camera. You can't hear a thing they're saying. Sometimes they'll give you subtitles, but it's chaotic. They're pissed. They're running everywhere. And then it ended with Aaron freaking out, pulls off all of his equipment, sets the camera down, and he says, someone just walked right by me and said, "Hey," in my ear. So then they cut to commercial, and they go into the lockdown. So they just started 5 minutes in and their batteries die again. They really believe that there's a lot of spiritual energy that is pulling from them, pulling from their equipment. And, they're pumped about it. But Zach gets pissed. He's like, I just put these in 5 minutes ago. They caught on camera a white anomaly with a whooshing sound. And you can hear it. And so they believe it's like a prisoner coming out to shank someone. I don't know. I saw the white anomaly. I get it. But the shank, I don't know. That kind of threw me off. Zach saw a silhouette of a head where it was like popping up. So they are in the cell where the man burned alive. And Nick is doing an EVP, and he's like standing in there, and his eyes are wide open, like freaky open. And he's like, something is in here. He keeps telling Zach that. He's like, I feel numb. I have goosebumps everywhere. And then an EVP comes through of a man that says, I'll chew you. It could have been something different, but it was a little harder to hear. But yeah. And then they did catch on camera a free-floating figure coming out of a cell, like right behind Zach. I had a hard time seeing it. I don't know why, or if it was the glare of my window on my TV or something, but I just was like, I should watch them on my computer, but I didn't. So then Zach puts on this word technology thing. It's like from his early episodes where it had like it looked like sunglasses, but like weird like Star Trek sunglasses or something. And yeah. Anyway, so they are still in that area with this word thing, and Zach's walking around asking questions, and they get the word drag. And they are all freaking out because I guess wardens or guards or whatever drug his body out of the cell. And so, yeah. And then they started getting a really bad interference on it and on the cameras. Then all of a sudden they got the words pass and fly. And so after doing all this research, Stephanie told us that it was James Lockhart that supposedly had set himself on fire. And so the guy that gave them the tour, who was a previous inmate, his name was DJ Fly. So that's what they put with it. And he said he was really good friends with this guy who set himself on fire. So, a lot of unexplained footsteps in the hole. In the cell block, you can hear the doors slamming shut. And that is probably the creepiest thing, because they're very big, heavy metal doors. And like, that's not something that a piece of wood falling on the floor or something could imitate. So that one really got me, where like the slamming shut of the cell doors, it's like, that takes effort. That isn't a gust of wind, So that's the creepy part for me a lot, is doors. Um, and oh, in that area, the tour guide had told him that he was violently punched at, at one point. So they brought in one of the tour guides, her name is Sarah, as a trigger object because they don't particularly care for the women that work there. And so they let her go off on her own. So they're there with Sarah, kind of asking things, and she's like, I feel someone breathing down the back of my neck. I really feel. And then they got an EVP of a breathing sound, and I think it's legit. It's very creepy breathing. And then another EVP that said, run, Sarah. Oh, come on. No. Creep. No. So they let Sarah go off on her own. In the pitch black, I'm pretty sure they did not give her a flashlight. I think she just had an infrared camera, actually. So they're all separated, and all of a sudden, every single one of them hear a cell door slam shut. Again, the doors get me, man. And so they pan back to Sarah, and she keeps hearing, feeling something breathing on her. And Zach kind of got this feeling. He's like, I feel like Sarah needs help. Should we go check on her? And that's when the cell door shut, and all three of them, they're like, Sarah, and she's like, help me, please. And so, or come get me, or something like that. And so they all ran down there, and she's freaking out because she felt like her hair had been pulled. She was freezing, and they got an EVP that said, sorry, Sarah, sorry. Just, oh my gosh, no. And then they were all standing there, and this very loud growl came from all around them. Just, oh my goodness. I think I'll be Stephanie and just go during the day, And then some of the cameras they had set up, one in the morgue. You can hear a ton of noises and clatters. And then in the hospital, a very creepy voice came through. You just can't understand what it said. So that is it for today. That's the Ohio State Reformatory in Mansfield, Ohio. Hope you guys enjoyed it. On the 13th, which is Monday, we have another bonus Dark Tale. I haven't picked it out yet. I've been procrastinating, but these are usually pretty easy and pretty fun to find. And then our next episode is March 15th. Episode 40, we're going to Maine. Episode 41, we're going to North Dakota. And then on the 23rd, we will have our next zodiac sign, which is Aries. So look for that. And if you guys could rate and review, that'd be amazing. If you go onto Spotify or iTunes or anywhere you guys get your podcasts. And you can follow me on social media. I have an Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and TikTok. And I have a Patreon also if you guys would like to support the show. So thank you again for joining me and for all of your support. And we will see you on the 13th. Bye.